Hello, everybody, including poetry lovers. This is Jim Ransom with another episode of Morning Jim Poetry. You'll remember the last week program was mostly given over to reading one of Robert Browning's dramatic monologue, free verse poems. His free verse poems, when I was a kid, and that's a long time ago, were still popular as dramatic readings in speech classes, various schools. And so I read The Bishop Orders His Tomb at St. Praxed's Church. And I also read one of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's most famous poems, which is a sonnet, How Do I Love Thee? Let Me Count the Ways. This is a type of romantic poetry that's not really all that popular anymore. But I think one of my ideas in doing this show is to skip around in various ages of poetry and let everybody have an example of what poetry was like many years ago, as well as to have most poems from the present era. And so, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, what can we say about her? Well, first of all, she was 6 years older than Robert Browning and had become a pretty well-known poet who was making money out of poetry long before she met Robert Browning. So she was in some respects the senior partner in that arrangement. And she had a series of poems which were published, and this was after she was married to Robert Browning. This series of poems was called Sonnets From The Portuguese. Does that seem odd to you? Especially if you know that Elizabeth Barrett never went to Portugal, didn't speak Portuguese, and probably knew nobody who was Portuguese. But Robert Browning's pet name for her was My Portuguese. So he encouraged her to publish the poems under that title, and they became extremely popular in that era. It should be said that Elizabeth Barrett was a very well-educated child who had a private tutor. She may have been at least as well-educated, maybe more so than Robert Browning. She was an early advocate against child labor and slavery. Ironically, her father's wealth was derived from slave labor on plantations in the Caribbean, and his wealth was damaged a great deal by Britain's abolition legislation in 1833, which ended slavery in all British colonies, many years before it was ended in America. So it may have been that, if he knew it, that Robert Barrett was not very happy about her stance on slavery. But it may be that he didn't really know, because she wrote a lot of essays for various literary magazines opposing slavery and promoting women's rights, and I'm sure that her father did not know about those efforts on her behalf. Elizabeth carried on a romance with Robert Browning, who wrote, after he wrote to tell her that he admired her poetry. Now, she was 6 years older than he was, and so perhaps it's not surprising that she was better known when they met than he was. The romance was rather furtive because Barrett's father had a lot of idiosyncrasies, and one was that he had told all of his children that they should never marry if they wanted to get an inheritance from him. Uh-oh. As a matter of fact, most of his daughters did not marry except for Elizabeth, but I don't think it worked with the boys. He had 12 children, half of them were boys and half were girls. Anyway, after her marriage to Browning, which was done privately, her parents were not there, and I don't think his were either, although it's possible that his mother might have been. So the two of them moved to Italy to get away from Papa Barrett. And they lived mainly off money that Elizabeth had earned from her writing, since Robert Browning was not yet widely established and well-paid poet. So Elizabeth was no longer getting any allowance from her father, who had been paying her way for many, many years. And they became quite estranged. Now, Elizabeth was never in very good health. She was certainly healthy enough to carry on a sub rosa romance with Robert Browning, but she sort of kept herself going with doses of opium and laudanum, which were available over the counter in those days. And people who write about her felt that she had been injured in a fall from a pony at an early age and had back pain, and perhaps that had something to do with it. Elizabeth Barrett suffered 3 miscarriages after the marriage, and oh boy, it was felt she finally woke up to the fact that maybe using laudanum and opium wasn't good for pregnancy. So she quit and became pregnant again, and she had a successful full-term pregnancy and gave birth to a boy who was nicknamed Penn. I think he was named Robert Barrett Browning. He later became a somewhat successful artist, but gave that up when his eyesight failed. He married once, and that wasn't successful. He never liked to work, and it's doubtful that he ever supported himself. He got support, however, from his father and then his father's estate after him. For me, the history of the Browning and Barrett families has been at least as interesting as their poetry, and I'm ashamed to say that since I'm supposed to be reading poetry, but I read quite a bit about them, and they led interesting lives in an era when well-to-do middle-class people without titles were quite frequent in Britain, and this was because of the of the great wealth being brought into Britain through the empire that it had created by that time. But right now I'm going to read 2 more sonnets by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. You know, we have to get a little poetry, don't we? And these both are from Sonnets from the Portuguese. And the first one is actually one of the last poems in that sequence. And I found it in a book that I've had for many years, a series of 2 books that was published by Viking on poetry in the English-speaking world, and it had a fairly good-sized section on the Brownings. So here's Sonnets from the Portuguese, number 14. If thou must love me, let it be for naught except for love's sake only. Do not say I love her for her smile, her look, her way of speaking gently, for a trick of thought that falls in well with mine, and certes brought a sense of pleasant ease on such a day. For these things in themselves, beloved, may be changed, or changed for thee, and love so wrought may be unwrought so. Neither love me for thine own dear pities wiping my cheeks dry. A creature might forget to weep, who bore thy comfort long, and lose thy love thereby. But love me for love's sake, that evermore thou mayst love on, through love's eternity. That's a very romantic poem by a highly intellectual woman who expressed her true emotions best in verse. Now, then, I'm going to move on quickly to the second poem that I said I would read. And this is the very first sonnet from the Portuguese. It's number 1. I thought once how Theocritus had sung of the sweet years, the dear and wished-for years, who each one in a gracious hand appears to bear a gift for mortals, old or young. And as I mused it in his antique tongue, I saw in gradual vision through my tears the sweet, sad years, the melancholy years, those of my own life, who by turns had flung a shadow across me. Straightway I was wary, so weeping how a mystic shape did move behind me and drew me backward by the hair. And a voice said in mastery, while I strove, "Guess now who holds thee." "Death," I said. But there the silver answer rang, "Not death, but love." An interesting poem, to say the least. And I should say that Theocritus was the first Greek poet, the first Greek poet to write about the countryside. These were called bucolic poems, or verses about country life. And this style permeated much of poetry during the Romantic era, including poems by Keats and Byron and Wordsworth and Shelley, to name a few. And Elizabeth Browning, among her many accomplishments, had mastered classical Greek. So she had read Theocritus in the original classic Greek language. Those were people and days which we don't appreciate today, and because bucolic romanticism among the super wealthy is not nearly as possible as beach homes in Alabama or Florida or California, or any place where large amounts of money are appreciated. And it's generally in this day and age not money that's spent on improving oneself intellectually, is it? Maybe it should be. Anyway, that's it for today, and I hope you'll be back next week when we'll have a shorter program, I hope, a little shorter program with more poetry, and we'll be moving up to modern times. Bye now.